Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Underserved, the podcast for the rest of the tech industry. I'm your host, Andrew Gelina. With me this morning in studio is Jim Martin, CIO of Shepley Bulfinch. Jim, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Glad to have you here. It's very strange to see people in person these days.
It is a rare benefit.
So a thing I often ask folks right off the bat is, tell us what got you excited about technology way back when you were a kid.
Yeah, so I was pretty fortunate. My dad owned a franchise of Culligan's soft water conditioning. He basically sold equipment that made hard water soft. And I don't know how he got it into his head, because he actually had an economics major, I believe, in college, although that was before my time. He decided he was going to buy an IBM PCXT and Fox Pro for DOS, and he wrote his own ERP, basically, managed the entire business from that thing. And so every time he would upgrade a computer, there would be the old computer at the house, because my mother's job was actually to do quality control, and she is really good at finding bugs in software, as it turns out. So that was a huge boon and a huge frustration for my father. But we always had computers kind of rolling around the house, and I'm actually dyslexic. And when I was in school, I was trying to find things that I could do that would make life easier for me. And spell check was one of those magical things that once you find it, if you really need it, you cannot live without it anymore. So I remember one of the first papers that I handed in, probably in 6th or 7th grade. I didn't know what caps lock was. So I wrote the entire document, and I think like WordStar or something really old. And I had the whole thing in caps lock. I handed it in to my teacher, and she was like, all right, well, the plus side is I can read it, because that's a huge step up from your handwriting, Mr. Martin. But on the minus side, it's all caps. And I said, all right, well, I'll figure out how to fix that next time. And so next time I did. But I used computers all through school. And probably one of the really pivotal things was I really liked being artistic, but I don't really have what is called a good hand. So I'm not particularly good at making what is in my head show up on a piece of paper.
Amen to that.
Yeah. So, but, I took a mechanical drafting class in high school, and we used Logo. And Logo is a early program. Kind of its big claim to fame is there's this little turtle on the screen, and you just basically tell the turtle what to do. And so I was able to actually program the turtle to say, all right, go here, turn 45 degrees, go here this long, and just made this really long program to basically draw an isometric version of a very simple house, more like a shack. But it looked like what I expected it to look at the end. And that was one of the first times I actually had that experience with art. In high school, we had TRS-80s, and I did some basic programming. And one of the things that was pretty cool is that I figured out how to code a drawing program. So using the arrow keys, you could make it draw something out. And then it was like, oh, well, Tron, obviously, sort of thing. That was kind of cool. But during that experience, I realized that programming was probably not for me, because you have to be able to spell variables the same way multiple times during the programming process in order to have a successful program at the end.
Nowadays with the editors, though, they have like an autocomplete.
Too late for me. Too late.
Yeah, me too.
Technology failed me.
I was born too early.
Too early. Man before my time. But honestly, if computers hadn't been around, my life would have been a lot more difficult. My first computer was, I think, a TRS-80 something or other from Radio Shack. And I learned that I could play games on it if I put in a cassette tape and listened to the musical language of machine code kind of going through. And I saw my dad doing stuff with it for business. So I really learned early on that the computer is a tool that has an amazing amount of flexibility and versatility. And that if you can imagine a way to solve a problem and you understand the technology, you can make something really useful to you. I think that's something that stuck with me all through my years. I got into architecture school and realized very quickly that my skills in architecture were dwarfed by my skills in technology. And I wasn't all that skilled. I was just skilled compared to the people around me, which was enough. So in architecture school, I was always bringing my computer, which at the time was a smoking fast 486 DSX with the math coprocessor chip in it. And that thing just ripped through renderings, which in Logo, what I did was I just created the actual picture I wanted. But in architecture school, I could actually use three-dimensional drawing and objects. And then the big problem was hiding the lines that didn't exist from the view that you were presenting. And I remember the early program just had a little guy running across the screen as a status of, yeah, I'm still working. And occasionally he would get to a particularly difficult part of the rendering and then start running backwards. And that was always very demoralizing because you always work until the last possible second and then hit render. And if you missed it, then you're like, well, I'm going to be a half an hour late for my design crit sort of thing.
My guy is moonwalking. This is no good.
It's not good. I'm pretty sure that's where Michael Jackson got it, though.
Yeah, editing video nowadays, last thing I'll do is slap on denoise or something like that, and it just slows it to a crawl, even on a massive, massive machine.
But it's still better than doing it by hand.
It sure is. So when I was a kid, I had the same thing. I had a computer at home, which was kind of unusual at the time. We had a computer at school and some extra credit, and was a logo fan myself.
Nice.
Maybe I'm curmudgeonly or getting old, but nowadays, like, yes, we have plenty of computers at home and the kids have computers at school, but it still seems to be just as uncommon for a kid to be like, you know what, I want to program. Because now it's like, I want to watch YouTube, I want to be a content creator, but you don't see a lot of kids picking it up. And if I get more time, I'm definitely going to try and get kids, starting with my own, more excited in programming and programming literate.
Yeah, I think it's tough because, really, what is the problem that the child is trying to solve? And is a computer the right tool to help them solve that problem? We also had instruments growing up around my house. We had a piano, I got a saxophone at one point, and I have absolutely no more ability in music than I did in art. I can appreciate it for sure, but no one wants to listen to me, much less myself. So it wasn't the tool that I needed at the time in order to solve any of my problems. I'm just as happy to listen to someone who's really good at it than try and bash my head against that particular wall and try and get adequate at it.
Yeah, I had to play trombone for like 4 years from 4th to 8th grade.
Yeah, you had more stick-to-itiveness than I did.
I wasn't very good at it.
Yeah.
I wasn't very into it. Not like when I got into skateboarding, I'm like, yeah, I want to do this every free second of the
Right.
day. But I got good enough and I could read music and could play. And I appreciated that later on. And it made me appreciate music. And someone who can really play well became immediately evident. So fast forward over the years, you work in mostly IT or mostly architecture firms or a mix of both, or?
So when I graduated college, I joined my first architecture firm, and I was doing architecture for the first year and a half, and I just realized that they needed way more help on the technology side than they did on the architecture side. It takes a long time to actually understand what the hell you're doing to put a building together. Buildings are incredibly complex. And I already knew a lot of technology stuff because in high school, I had gotten a job doing computer integration in and around New York and New Jersey. We grew up in Chatham, New Jersey, shout out. So I had wandered around New York, New Jersey, the tri-state area sort of thing, fixing computers for people, which were sometimes complicated. Back then, we didn't have DIMMs. We had soldered on or pressure-fitted ROM and RAM. So doing all kinds of weird stuff with that, which seems very archaic these days. Honestly, one of the biggest things that we ended up doing that I can recall is walking into a pencil factory somewhere in New Jersey, and they were complaining that the computer was overheating. And I opened the back of the computer and peeled off about a 1/4 inch thick of ash because it was a smoking environment. And I'm like, well, there's your problem right there. No more ash blanket on top of your processing, and you should be just fine. It's crazy. So for me, I really like delivering value. And that's the thing that I always kind of look for. It's like, how can I deliver value? And anyone who knows me for any length of time will know that value is a word that comes out of my mouth a stupid amount of times. But when I was in my first architecture firm, I realized that as an IT person who understood the business, I could deliver more value than as a junior architect who didn't know anything about putting buildings together. So after a year and a half, kind of made the pivot into IT. And I was at that firm for a grand total of about 17 years. And then my current firm is another architecture firm. So I have so far made a career out of being an IT person in architecture firms. It's interesting because I oftentimes hear my colleagues lament about the gap between IT and business. And I've never really felt that because I came to IT through effectively what is the business that I work in these days. And there's a lot of things that we do to kind of make sure that IT is in fact supporting the business so closely that the business doesn't think of IT as being a separate thing or a separate entity or a separate cost structure or cost center. And a lot of that is really very deliberate because if we can provide more value to the business and the business doesn't see us as our IT department as just this thing that just keeps taking and taking and taking profit and revenue away, but it's also giving back to the business in very clear and concise and obvious ways.
Yeah, there's different levels of IT appreciation that I've seen in companies, depending on whether the company is delivering something that is a computer program at the end of the day, like Monster.com. The sales folks definitely appreciated the developers like, hey, you get this new stuff out the door, it gives me something new to sell.
Right.
It actually helps increase revenue. This is great. I can make my quota more easily. Whereas some other places, it's very easy for it to just look like a cost center and not an enabler.
Yeah. Well, at this point, at least, no computer program that I'm aware of can actually design a building. We still rely on the knowledge that is in people's heads in order to put something that complex together in a way that elegantly solves the problem that our clients have. But we can get creative about the value that we can provide back to the business. And I've tried very hard to do so. So one of the things that we do is half of our department is actually made up of design technology specialists. And in the world of architecture, we have a lot of different tools that we can use. And it is always way harder to design something in a vacuum than it is to design something with constraints. I imagine you probably can appreciate that, trying to drag constraints out of people before you can design them the perfect application. Mm-hmm. The same thing holds true on the architecture side of things. So constraints are a really, really important part of the process. And for us, one of the things that we deliver to our business is design technology specialists. So we hire architects and interior designers out of school, and we have them in the IT department doing help desk and R&D and teaching them everything that we know and have learned across generations of design technology specialists about how to use all the software that we use to create stuff. Because one of the biggest lessons that I learned in college actually is that I got very frustrated because I couldn't get the computer to do the things that I needed it to do in order to get the ideas that were in my head out on paper. And it was a direct flashback to when I was a kid, and that annoyed the crap out of me. So I worked super hard to get really good at the software so that I could actually manhandle the software into creating the geometry that I wanted to see. And I think our design technology specialists at Shepley do the same thing. They figure out how to use the tools in order to get done what they want to get done. And then after they're in our department for maybe a year or two, we release them into the wild onto the project teams to continue their career as architects or interior designers. The really great thing about that is they're then sought after by these teams because they're relatively green still, a couple of years out of college, and they really don't know how buildings get put together yet either, but they really know the tools that we use. And all of the people who are on that team are kind of lifted up by these skills of that individual. They're not doing tickets and tech support anymore, but they are absolutely just kind of saying, oh, well, we should maybe do it this way, or, hey, we should use this software to do this thing, or were you aware that it could do this sort of deal? So that's really one of the products that IT delivers to Shepley. It's highly capable, very digitally native architects and interior designers who can help make everyone else better. The other thing I like about the system we've put into place is that if the design technology specialists do their job well and they're very responsive, which is something that's really important because that's something we also want our people to be for our clients, they're sought after. And if you just have a new hire coming into the firm, there's always this period of time where you don't know who they are, what they're capable of, what their work ethic is, what things they're good at or bad at, all the rest of this fun stuff. So people that graduate from our department are well-known quantities, and people really understand how to use them and want to work with them and understand the value that they can bring to their projects. So they have more respect than someone else, maybe with the same amount of experience, would have if they were joining a firm new.
Yeah, if you can help teach the team how to fish better, even though you're not that experienced at being an architect yet, I think everyone appreciates when someone can bring something valuable like that to the team, even if they are a couple of years out of school.
Yeah, put expert fishermen on the boat and everyone else is going to watch them at least a little bit.
Yep.
What are they doing?
We try to do the same thing at Syrinx when we're developing solutions. Also, a lot of times we're working alongside software developers and other professionals at our clients. And there's definitely a cross-pollination of skill sets and teaching a fish that goes both directions. And we like that because then when we go to the next client, invariably, in addition to teaching, we always end up learning something from each engagement. You can kind of bring that experience of what to do and what not to do. Tell them what works and what doesn't right out of the gate, save some time.
Yeah, and I think for me, that's knowledge management and knowledge transfer, which is something that I've been pretty interested in over the last probably 5 or 6 years. I've heard various people decry the end of the CIO for a long time now. It hasn't seemed to happen yet, And I still feel like we have a very important role to play in shaping how business and technology kind of work together in order to achieve shared goals. But managing information is all well and good, but if the information stays in a database somewhere and never gets used or turned into knowledge or, wisdom, hopefully, then it really has a limited amount of utility. So I've been doing a lot of work and a lot of thinking and listening to a lot of smart people and reading a lot of books and just trying to kind of get ahead of that whole idea of information being the end goal. And it's really, I think, knowledge is the end goal. So creating a generational program of design technology specialists where one can learn from the last, and we are kind of adding to the total knowledge set of what we can do. And, you pass something off because you're tired and someone else runs with it for a little bit and does something unexpected because they've got different life experience to bring to it, or they saw some different way of doing things. They tried it and it worked really well. And we do that in our business as well as in the IT department. And so trying to figure out ways to identify the positive deviants and hold them up as really good examples and trying to get other people to say, oh, I can actually riff on that a little bit, throw my spin on it and do something else. And maybe that'll be great. And it might actually not be great. But if it isn't, we at least know that that's maybe not a direction we wanted to go. I fight with the same tendency that many other architects have, which is perfectionism. And the way that I try and work on perfectionism is to think about everything as experiments. So there's a hypothesis, I think it might do this. And then you figure out a way to test that and measure it, and then figure out whether or not what you expected to happen actually happened. And if it doesn't, what can you learn from that? And if it does, what can you learn from that? And then rinse and repeat and do lots of small things rather than have to worry about this giant, big, huge thing. And you do enough of those things and you'll end up in a much better place than you are. I'm actually a huge fan of the concept of lean, Six Sigma and theory of constraints as well. But I think lean is the thing that ties the most into the work that I have a tendency to do. And it's really just all about identifying ways and doing small improvements over time that really add up to big improvements for any given process.
So it sounds like a rather iterative approach to things, which reminds me a lot of like software development, breaking things into sprints, and you deliver something after a 2-week sprint, and then maybe you refine it in the next sprint. Does that happen in architecture, or is it kind of got to design the cellar before you design the building, and that has to be done before you can start putting something on top of it?
Yeah, I think it could be done in architecture. It is not generally done in architecture. And I will put the proviso out here, since this will be on the internet for the world to listen to. My impression is that Agile actually is lean theory applied to software development. So lean theory applied to architecture is a bit of an unknown. I do know that there's some people who are playing with it and having some success with it. I've not done any of that myself. For me, the manifestation that has made the most sense and been the easiest to deal with is just that experimentation model. Do a bunch of small things, figure out how to measure what impact it had, rinse and repeat. Because as I said, the thing that most architects have a bit of perfectionism in them, and that is a huge benefit in certain situations and a huge detractor in others. It's always a challenge to try and figure out what situation are you in, and should you let your perfectionism flag fly, or do you go with the more iterative approach and say, fine, I'm going to trust that the outcome is going to be better than trying to design the entire thing in my head and then just document like crazy and say, well, this is it, which doesn't allow for a lot of room for other people to have input. So if you're dealing with larger and larger projects, that has a tendency to work for star architects. That's an actual word in the industry, but not really a lot of other people can get away with it unless you're a smaller practice where you can actually keep all the details in the heads of one person.
Mm. Yeah, there's a similar concept in programming. They'll say that truly exceptional software developer can be 10x productive as a normal software developer, and that trying to mix the two on teams can sometimes work, sometimes not work, especially if the gifted person doesn't kind of divest some of their knowledge and share it within the team. What type of things does Shepley Bulfinch design? Is it like stadiums? Is it giant buildings, smaller buildings? Is there a sweet spot?
Yeah, we mostly do education buildings, healthcare buildings, and we have a bunch of developer work as well, and we do some development type of stuff. We have buildings all over the place. I think our firm is the largest continually operating architecture firm in the country. And H.H. Richardson, who's a very famous architect, was the progenitor of our firm. So you go back to things like Trinity Church, and if you're around the Boston area, South Station in Boston, and the original Children's Hospital was one of Shepley's early projects in the century before the last century.
Wow, that's a heck of a legacy.
Yeah, we have a pretty cool archives, actually. You can see a lot of really interesting stuff. It's astounding the level of documentation that used to be required to build a fairly large building versus the level of documentation required now. At some level, the fact that we can do it all on the computer has meant that we are trying to design more than we used to. We used to leave a lot more to the artisan contractors, but for a number of reasons, things have gotten more complicated over time and didn't have to worry about wiring and HVAC and stuff like that. It was just open the window if you want to breeze.
Yeah. Yeah, earthquakes and power efficiency and
future flexibility. What do you want this thing to be in 10 years when your current needs change? And how do you make sure that it's designed in such a way that it allows for you to change its purpose without having to knock down a bunch of walls? Stuff like that.
Woohoo! This is my 25th recruiter call for the same job today. New high score! The 3-week wait between my first interview and my second interview is my favorite time of year.
My recruiter says he is my best friend, but I haven't heard from him since I started the job 2 years ago.
Your background in real estate and multi-level marketing makes you the perfect person to advise me on tech careers.
Finding your next consulting gig should not be this difficult. Quite frankly, you deserve better. Syrinx is the consulting company founded and run by software consultants. We get you. Find out why our employees are some of the happiest and best paid consultants in the industry at syrinx.com. That's SYRINX.com. Find a better way today. Syrinx Consulting is a proud sponsor of Underserved, the podcast for the rest of the tech industry. So what sort of software do you guys have deployed to help the architect? Is there a particular CAD package or something that everyone uses, or?
Yeah, I mean, if you're in the U.S. and you're doing large buildings, you're probably using Autodesk software. We use Revit, as do a lot of other large firms in the country. And it's always an interesting kind of balance. Architects have a tendency to be very creative. And in some cases, they're creative in good ways. And in some cases, they're creative in difficult ways. And I don't know how Autodesk does it. Sometimes they do it better than others, but there's this need to accommodate all of the different things that architects are going to want to do about things. And they've created very, very powerful software that can be used well and that can be used poorly, as with anything. I mean, you give anyone a piece of technology, there's good things you can do with it, and there's not as good things to do with it. So for our design technology specialists, they spend a lot of time getting to be really facile with Revit as a piece of software because it is so powerful and has so many different options for how you can do something. Back in the day, when I was on the boards doing architecture, I got handed this set of drawings in AutoCAD we used in those days in DOS. And I was trying to snap the center of a line. And it was a dotted line. And I kept looking at them like, that is not the center of this line. And it turned out that the person who had done the work before me, who had drawn the dotted line, had drawn a series of lines, not one line with a line type that would indicate that it was dotted. Seemed perfectly reasonable for them to do that at that point, because the point was, it just needs to look right when it's printed. But you come back afterwards and you try and snap to the center and you're just getting one of the segments of the line and it doesn't look right anymore. And it's not the right decision anymore. And so that sort of nuance, it's like things that you do that are expedient because you're trying to get something done that then turn out to be bad decisions in hindsight because someone else is trying to do something different that you didn't anticipate. There's a lot of that tension in the modeling process of buildings because so many decisions have to be made. And the analogy that I always make is Revit is a container for decisions. So you just keep putting decisions into it and putting decisions into eventually you have a building. But if you have to undo one of those things, you may have to take a lot of decisions out of the box again, put a better decision into it, and then start piling more decisions on top of it again. So it's a complicated thing. And the trade-off of giving us the ultimate flexibility to do whatever we can imagine is that sometimes we don't imagine the right things and we have to kind of go back and readjust, or something that seemed like a good idea at the time ended up not being such a good idea and causes some rework to be done.
This sounds exactly like software engineering.
It's just a different product.
You pick a bad library, you pick a bad pattern or something like that, and you hope that you abstracted it away enough that you can tear it out and replace it without too much spackling.
Yep. Our spackle is real, though.
Yeah, same thing in Reaper for that matter, the audio editor. It's so incredibly flexible. People use it for producing albums, for producing podcasts, for anything. And there's so many different ways to do things, but some of them paint you into a corner. And
some of them are limiting.
Yeah. What's the status of your office? Are people allowed in? Do they sometimes come in? Do they always come in?
IT's been in and out. Some administrative folks have been in and out. No one's working in the office full time at this point. We're getting ready to go back. Our phase 1 reopening is the week after Labor Day, so 3 weeks from now. I'm actually heading in after this to go through, and we're going to figure out what the hotel desk situation is going to look like. But we're actually losing our lease in our Boston office in February of next year. So it's not going to be long before we're trying to pack everything up and then have to do demo on the space to get it back to where we found it so we can hand it back to the landlord.
So we lucked out. So we just moved offices, as you know. Normally, I guess it's a matter of course, even in small spaces like ours now, to make the tenant deal with ripping out all of the tel data.
Yeah.
Upon exit.
Class A office space. Yeah.
Yeah. And I go through our lease, and we'd been there 10 years. And luckily, at the beginning of the lease,
they didn't know that.
That did not exist. Yeah, because when we moved in, there was working tel data throughout it. Why would you tear it out? It's all terminated in the closet. It's neat. It's labeled.
As long as it's not Cat 3.
Yeah, if it ain't broke. So we just used it for 10 years.
Yeah.
It was Cat 5. It was fine. And yeah, then when we went in here, we had to do it from scratch.
Yeah.
I'm sure our new lease says we must unscratch.
Yeah, unscratch it all. Yeah, for us, gig to the desktop is actually really important for the workloads that we run. We had very high-powered laptops sitting in the office as close as we could get to the storage as possible because Revit is a 3D modeling program, and we've got multiple people working on it at the same time, and it's very taxing. So when everyone went to home, everyone already had laptops, which is great. So we were kind of ahead of the curve. But we realized that all those laptops with all that RAM and the i7 processors were not really helping that much when people were at their home on residential internet, far away from where all the actual data lived.
How big is the data for a building?
I mean, it depends on the building. For the buildings we work on, it's anywhere between 500 megabytes and a gig and a half.
So it's downloadable, but it'll take you a minute.
The big trick from a technology perspective is that when you want to save your work, because it's a multi-user model, you basically download the model that exists in the gold standard, compare it against what you have, and then save up the delta, which represents all the changes you've made.
Ship the diffs. And if you have a crummy home internet situation, and they're all asymmetrical at this point, so your upload speed is always slower than your download speed. Verizon Fios.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I've got at my house, but not everyone picked their house based on where Verizon was available.
I sure did.
Me too. Thank you, EMC in Hopkinton. So we're actually right now really focused on getting into Azure, and we're going to try very hard to get VDI up and running in Azure as well by the end of the year. Because we're not sure how long this is going to last, but we know we're not going to have an office in February. And whatever we decide to do as a business, I don't want IT being the anchor. So I'm looking for a lot more flexibility than we currently have because we currently have our data center in our office. So we'll either do an external data center. It's kind of my second choice because it doesn't solve all of my problems. Moving everything to Azure, going to completely VDI, I can still keep all the compute next to the storage, and it's just all in the cloud. And then all of our laptops just turn into very competent endpoints.
Are they thin clients at that point to the compute that's happening in the cloud, or are they still pulling it down and then shipping diffs once you finish your work?
No, it should all get done in the cloud.
Okay.
Autodesk also has a product called BIM 360, which is good for some of our workload, but doesn't necessarily completely solve the problem of work from home. So what will completely solve the problem of work from home is very low bandwidth video information back and forth over RDP, and then doing all that compute in the cloud. So we'll see. We're going through the design right now. We'll probably be doing the actual moving in November, December timeframe.
I got to imagine you guys, like everyone, especially with a looming lease, are like, do we need this much space anymore?
Yeah, but we need space to collaborate. We're just not sure when it's going to be safe to do so. So again, I'm looking to do two things. I'm looking to change our revenue. I want our cost to be tied to our revenue, which is cost to our headcount. And I also want to make sure that we are as flexible as possible so that whatever space we decide to design for all the kind of in-person networking and workshops that have to happen in order to get a whole bunch of people on the same page about all the decisions that I mentioned prior, whatever we decide to do as a business as far as our next space, I want to make sure that we can do that purely on what the business needs. And the idea is that whatever that space will end up being is going to be very simple from a technology perspective. And all the complexity is going to be in the cloud where we're solving several other problems at the same time. pretty sure we can afford it. We're still doing our cost analysis of it. I've been fortunate enough to know a lot of people who've done it already, and I know that there are ways to do it right, as with anything. And I really would prefer not to actually make costly mistakes that I'm going to have to pay a lot in order to fix. So we're trying to do it as wisely as we possibly can.
So I met you through SIM, the Society for Information Management. How did you get involved in it, and what do you like so much about it? You're not only a client, you're the president.
I know, seriously. Yeah, so in 2012, I want to say, my time at my first firm kind of ended. The pressures of the economy and the economic downturn in 2008 and a changing of the presidents and all the rest of that fun stuff, I found myself without a job for the first time in 17 years. And my portfolio coming out of college in architecture was probably not good enough to get me a job somewhere else. So when that happened to me, it was the first time that I'd really been in that position in my career. I realized the network that I had built for myself, the people that I knew and the people that I could rely on, were really geared towards solving the problem of my prior company and really weren't shaped in a way that was actually going to help me find my next position. So I was talking to a bunch of recruiters and trying to kind of get a lay of the land and figure out what that journey looked like, never having been on it before. And one of the recruiters was kind enough to refer me to SIM. And I joined SIM and I went to my first meeting and I almost walked out of it because I was incredibly intimidated. I'm an introvert, so I can talk to people all day long. But at the end of the day, if I'm around 40 people, 50 people, 80 people, I probably need to take a nap after the fact. And walking into a room full of people that I assumed all knew each other and I didn't know was very, very daunting to me. And having to kind of figure out who to know and all the rest of that fun stuff. But fortunately, I actually ended up sitting at a table for dinner with one of the past presidents of the chapter. And he suggested that I maybe would be interested in getting involved in one of the chairs that kind of helps her run the chapter. And at the time, they were looking for someone to help out with membership. I figured, well, I'm brand new. I have a perspective that they probably don't have, so that might actually work. So I joined the membership committee and ended up chairing that after a couple of years. And the thing I really liked about that a lot is that I know how to work. I didn't really know how to network. So I was able to kind of jump in, help solve problems, help do some things for the chapter, and at the same time get to know people in a way that was a lot more comfortable for me than just wandering around, shaking hands and introducing myself, which I find very tiring. And then the reward for a job well done, I think, is another job. So eventually, after getting to the point where I was chairing membership, they asked me to be the secretary, the vice president, and the president. And so this is my year to be the president, and I'll be the ex-president next year, as I make room for other highly qualified people to kind of take my place. But the thing I like about SIM so much is that my network prior to SIM was really people just in my industry. And at SIM, I'm able to have conversations with other people about different problems than the problems that I'm currently having. And the tsunami of technology change hits different people at different times. And, it's really refreshing to have a candid conversation with someone who speaks the same language that I do, which I don't get a lot at work, actually. If I go full geek at work, I generally get glazed eyes, not like engagement with the people that I'm talking to. But at SIM, I can talk to people who certainly understand what I'm saying. The question is whether I understand what they're saying. So it's really nice to have a community of people who are trying to solve similar problems that you are, that you can ask for feedback or say, what are you working on? It's like, oh, that's interesting. I'm kind of seeing that on the horizon. Tell me more about how you're dealing with that and what experiences you've had. Mm-hmm. And it's just a fantastic place to get benchmarking information and advice. And people have been incredibly generous. And everyone kind of tries to help everyone out as much as possible. So if nothing else, I get to live vicariously through other people's mistakes and triumphs. And then when it's my turn, I'm just kind of like, all right, well, this is going to be a good story to tell someone someday. Good or bad, there's still some value because there's still someone I can tell it to, more or less. Because again, there's a finite number of people at Shepley Bulfinch who are interested in me talking about some of the things that I could talk about.
Networking, especially for technology introverts, which I would call myself as well. A lot of times it seems like a chore. It seems like something you just don't want to have to tackle. When you do, you're exhausted afterwards. You just picture like a Rotary Club meeting and like having a glad hand for 2 hours and talk. And having been to some sim meetings and become a member, I can say that it's not like that. It's very interesting. It's engaging. You're talking to people in the tech industry who have come up through the industry, have an interesting story to tell, have a lot of the same problems you do, regardless of what industry they're in. They face the same challenges, and you can find some fresh perspectives or maybe cheat off their paper when it comes to solving a particular issue. And it's just generally easy to kind of get to know folks. One thing I noticed since things went online during COVID that was kind of neat was when you guys would do the virtual meetings with Zoom, and then you'd do the breakout rooms where then you'd meet just a small number of people and be able to have a smaller interaction. I thought that was a good adaptation to what we were all kind of forced to live with, and something that may not even happen during a physical meeting.
Yeah, we're going to be meeting virtually even when we can get back into the same room as people and have safe interactions between human beings again in person. We're still going to have more virtual meetings than we had in the past at the chapter. But the trick is that no one is lacking for opportunities to have a webinar and sit in a webinar or whatever these days, because that's all that is being offered. And if you're doing a webinar, it doesn't matter what market you're in. So they just send it to everyone, and everyone could be stacked 4 deep in monitors and still not hit all the webinars that hit their inbox. So for us, we're not trying to sell anyone anything. We're trying to connect people with each other so they can help learn from each other and talk to each other and support each other. And so, as you say, one of the things that we did early on is like, well, we don't want to just have a lecture here. People need to talk to other people. So we figure out a way to use Zoom to use the breakout rooms. And one of the things that we've done recently is when you join a meeting, we were finding that it was super awkward. And, we live awkward, so that wasn't the end of the world, but it could be better. So when we join a meeting now, what we're doing is we're putting people into breakout rooms immediately. So it's not just this wall of faces. Join a meeting, we're doing a quick tech check to make sure that we can hear you. We also had some early issues at the beginning where we would have people joining both in video and in audio. And when we were doing breakout rooms, they would show up in 2 different places, like they were sawn in half. So their voice was in one room and their video was in the other. And then, being a bunch of technology leaders and professionals, both rooms were trying to help the person solve the problem. One could hear them and one could see them. It was this crazy magic trick that we were trying to not replicate.
So like if you joined with your phone for the audio, but your computer for the video.
Right. Yeah. So I was like, oh, all right. Well, that's a thing now. Didn't ever have to deal with that.
Yep.
But, it's a fantastic group of people, and everyone was very gracious as we were working through all the details of that stuff. But going forward, we kind of have a plan, and we're going to try and create opportunities to have those small interactions, because the goal of SIM is to provide a framework to allow people to build relationships with each other. And I personally believe that people build relationships through stories. And so we're trying to find a platform that will allow the most people to talk to other people and tell their stories so that you can get to know them and you can ask them for help if it's appropriate, or know how they might be able to help you or help them, and know what things you might know or have experienced might be of assistance to them.
If there was only like a podcast they could all appear on and then everyone else could listen to.
That sounds like crazy talk.
Having been a part of SIM now this year, I definitely recommend that if you're a technology executive, there are SIMs all over the place. This is the one that happens to be in the Boston area. Covers like Eastern Massachusetts. There's some folks from Rhode Island. I don't know. Is there anyone from New Hampshire?
We have some New Hampshires. We have 1 or 2 Mainers, I think.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's all over.
I definitely recommend checking it out, at least virtually now and maybe in person in the future. And to quote Sarah Morgan's advice, you really want to get out and do some networking before you need a network.
Yes. I really wish that my network had been in place in 2012. I think that would have been a much less stressful time in my life.
Well, Jim, thank you very much for braving it and making it in to see us. Glad to kick off season 3 with you.
Yeah, it's been great. Thanks for having me in.
And we'll look forward to talking to everyone else soon on the next episode of Underserved.